Hey, hope you're all well. Today I wanted to do a video on photographing property, basically buildings of various types for Microstock. Now, you would think this would be a pretty straightforward category to shoot. It's certainly a little bit easier to deal with from a photographer's perspective, when it comes to uploading that type of content, whether video or photography, it's actually harder than you think it should be. And part of that is because of the rules around editorial and commercial content. And another part of it is around the fact that the sites are a little different in their approaches and how they treat editorial images. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through how I approach uploading pictures of buildings, property for Microstock, and yeah, just remember that it's kind of a confusing category, and things don't always work out right. So you can't just follow a specific formula necessarily. You got to sort of feel the sites and follow what those individual sites work. But nevertheless, I have a sort of a approach that I do, and this works for, I think, the Microstock sites, and I also use this for Archangel, which is the photo cover, or the book cover site that I upload to. And so I sort of think these rules generally apply across the board. So when you're uploading property, the first thing you have to look at in the image is whether there is content in the image that you as a photographer don't own and therefore can't license. So basically your images are owned by you. You have the copyright in those images, but if there are elements in there that you just don't own, then that generally will shift the image from commercial to editorial. So you'll need to upload as editorial. And elements that you don't own can include basically three things. One is sort of trademarkable items or aspects of the image, like corporate branding, like logos. Also, those are typically potentially copyrightable works of art as well, so watch for brand logos. The second thing is works of art, so you'll see graffiti as an issue on buildings, and then also many cities that are doing murals now, so taking up building space and converting them into sort of pretty actually beautiful murals. So those are always an issue that you got to flag for yourself. And the third is a little bit more controllable, I think, is having identifiable people in images. Sometimes this is more of a problem when you're photographing interiors. But regardless, this issue comes up with all assets that are uploaded, whether photography or videography. And so you have to look for those elements first, and then that'll help you decide on whether to divert to commercial or go commercial or editorial. And you have to look for even the smallest of logos. You know, you're shooting a big skyline, there's a tiny logo in there somewhere. You still have to take that out if you want to upload it as commercial. Now with murals or graffiti, there are a little bit more concern. There's a little bit more sensitivity around that. I find that you're more likely to have those rejected even as editorial. So the thing that you need to look at with murals is whether the mural is the main subject of the image. If it is the main subject, you'll often need a release even for editorial. I don't necessarily care whether it's the main subject. I think if it is a main subject, then that's potentially going to catch you up as well. But generally, anything that has a mural in it, if you can't take it out, hit it towards the editorial and then see how that goes. And so there is some special rules, actually, like on Shutterstock. There is a rule that in San Francisco, images or assets taken in San Francisco, you can't upload graffiti or street art as even editorial images. So you just have to be live to the issue of street art and stuff like that, and murals in your images, because that will force you into an editorial, and it might not even save you there. So So that's really something to keep in mind. The third thing that you want to watch for, like as I mentioned already, is individuals. Try to shoot without them in it. They're hard to take out. If there are individuals in it, if the image is otherwise perfectly fine for commercial, you'll still need to make that an editorial image based on the fact that you don't want, well, unless you have the release, but if you don't have the release, it goes to editorial. Now, Adobe Stock, again, as you may or may not know, they're not really allowing editorial with individual images, or sorry, individual people. So having an identifiable person in your property related image on Adobe Stock will probably make it hard for you to submit that image anyway. So keep that in mind. Okay, and as a sub rule to the requirement that you don't include content that you can't license in your images, when I photograph residential real estate, I also take out the street address from the image, and I would also do that on a bigger commercial building, and if I think there's a chance that it's commercial. So having a street address on the image can actually push a reviewer to decide that that's editorial versus commercial. Now, Shutterstock and Big Stock are really the only ones that allow you to upload like that I'm aware of, and most of the other sites require you to send residential real estate photos to editorial regardless. So you have to decide where you're primarily uploading to. If you're a Shutterstocker, then you want to make sure you take that address info off. And once you've done it, then you might as well just send it up like that, because I think it's a better image anyway to the other sites. So that's like a 1B to the general rule on not including licensable content. It's a little different, but it's sort of roughly the same, I think. Okay, this is rule 2, and this is where things start to get a little bit more confusing. Now, like I said, this isn't like something that's necessarily step 1, step 2, step 3, but it's the second thing that I look for, or one of the main things that I look for when I'm deciding whether to upload image to commercial or to editorial for a property-related image. And so the rule is whether it is basically an isolated building, like one building is the subject of the photograph, versus whether there's a whole bunch of buildings, like a skyline or multiple buildings, so that you can say that no one image is the main subject. So I think that's the best way to look at it is, regardless of the number of buildings, is one of them the main subject? And if it is, then you're pushing yourself into editorial territory. I mean, there's more to the analysis, but that's kind of like the first thought process that you go through. Is one building a main subject, or is it the scene that's the main subject, and there just happens to be a whole bunch of buildings in there? So if it's a single subject building, or a single building as subject, then you're looking potentially at editorial. So I'll give you an example here. A skyline shot, assuming there's no logos, assuming there's nothing in there that's going to trip you up. You know, this skyline is a image that's licensable commercially, and you can fire away with that. And even this building, this photograph looking up in Calgary, it's got 4 separate buildings, and no one is the subject of the photograph, so this is also a commercial image. And like I was saying before, you can choose to leave the logos on, because they actually can add a lot of value to the image, and some of the buyers are looking for the logos. So you just have to think about the market you're focused on, the potential buyers, and you make a decision whether you want to have both, with logo and then sans logo. So that's one thing to always keep in mind when you're sort of churning through the thought process on uploading like a building property style images to Microstock. Okay, so this rule 3, this rule basically is focused on buildings that are subjects of the image. So I had mentioned sort of in the previous rule that if you photograph groups of buildings, you're generally okay commercial. If it's a single building, you might be in an editorial category now, but not always. And so let's just talk about when individual buildings are commercial and not editorial. So as always, the first question you ask is, no trademarks, trademarkable logos, no art, no individuals around that individual building. I assume that we've already dealt with that. That's been removed. Now we've got a clean single building image, and so it's time to say, okay, is this a commercial or editorial image? Okay, so the first thing you do with a single building is you ask some questions. This will lead you to decide on the category that it should be in. So what I look for is, is it a, and this may sound like kind of nonsense, and I'd love to hear like other people's opinions, but what I do is I say, okay, is it a big building? Is it new? Is it something that was recently constructed and designed by a famous architectural firm? There's a couple of those buildings in Calgary. One is by Foster & Partners. It's called the Bow Tower. You just can't get that uploaded as a commercial item in Calgary or on one of the Microstock sites. So there's that, right? And the opposite is it 500 years old? Is it generic? Like, would the person who have designed it have died 600 years ago? And would that copyright have expired there? So those are the kind of things you start with. Now I know that the idea of is it generic or is it recognizable by someone, it's kind of a hard question because obviously it's recognizable, but I don't think that's the question that you need to ask. The question I ask is, would a reviewer on a Microstock site think that the specific building is likely to be recognized by a general or a large group of people that maybe live in the area or maybe don't live in the area? So that's kind of what you ask. And so like a big office building is more likely to be recognized by people than a 1950s bungalow in the suburbs with no address on it. And so that's, I think, the approach that the reviewers take. And some of them, they're all individuals, right? I think, or the algorithm is random or whatever happens, but you never know. Some might lead towards being conservative and some not. But if you ask those questions and you sort of say objectively and not subjectively, like objectively, is this something, this building, is this something that like people are going to understand is a specific building, or is it more, I wouldn't be able to locate the town, I wouldn't be able to locate the region, or maybe, yeah, I know that's Alsace-Lorraine, but it could be from Strasbourg, it could be from 6 other cities in that area. So that's kind of what you want to think about when you're asking that question about whether a building's recognizable. And of course, the other thing about individual buildings, if it's a small, and so this goes back to whether it's a main subject of the image again, really, but if it's a small part of the image, like it's not, obviously not the subject of the image, like it takes up 10% of the image and it's really of the landscape or, a skyscape or something else, then yeah, obviously that plays into it. No, even if it's a more modern building. So that can also sort of shape your analysis on whether to upload as commercial or editorial. I think the other thing that you can try to do here is sort of manage the description and the keywords. Like if it is a generic building, then probably your description is going to reflect that, and the keywords are going to reflect a little bit of a generic quality as well. But if, on the other hand, you need to describe this as a specific building because the buyers are going to need this specific building, or the keywords have to include specific location info that identifies it as a very specific building, then that's a clue or that's a trigger for yourself to see or to think about whether you need to actually just bite the bullet and go editorial and then sort of forget about all the processing that goes with making a commercial. So like the description and the keywords can be a good way to sort of double check your thought process and make that decision on whether to proceed. That's generally how I look at uploading a single subject building to a stock site as far as commercial editorial. Okay, so rule 4, basically famous locations. Now I touched on this, I think briefly above on questions that you ask. That's not the focus of this special rule though. I think most people, or not most, I should say, a lot of new Microstock photographers particularly, are unaware of the sort of the maze of rules that are associated with specific properties. And these rules are typically statute-based, regulatory-based, or created by the locations where the property, or the property owners, I should say. So what that means is that you have to follow those rules. So how do you know those rules? You often learn when you upload and it gets rejected. That's one way to learn, trial by error. The other way to learn is to actually take the time to look at the websites, and they often have the rules included in their support materials for contributors. For example, on both Shutterstock and adobestock, they have extensive rules on extensive rules outlining known restrictions on buildings, and you have to look at them, and you have to know what they say. And having said that, I think it's, in my mind, it's sort of obvious, right? Even if the building's older and it's famous, it's the Eiffel Tower. You might want to check to see if there's something, because there's a good chance that there is something. And as it turns out, you're allowed to photograph commercially the Eiffel Tower during the day, but not at night. So the rules are subtle. So if it's a landmark building and it's 1,000 years old, and you don't think that maybe it's an abandoned medieval castle, and it's not even clear that there's an owner, then maybe there's no rules. But then again, some of the parks, for example, in the UK, they have special rules regarding heritage properties. So that's what you have to do with famous locations all the time. Yeah, and I'll just show you this one example. This is National Trust Properties. Here are the rules on Shutterstock, and it basically just says case-by-case basis. So what does that mean? Case-by-case what? Is it case-by-case commercial? Is it case-by-case editorial? Or is it, a mix? Or is it case-by-case, you can't upload at all? So the rules aren't always helpful, and whenever it says case-by-case, sadly, there's just no way to find out what's going to happen except by uploading the image and seeing what happens. And if it doesn't work, then you can always flip back to editorial. The downside is that sometimes you'll upload again as editorial, and the next reviewer says, well, that's actually commercial. So you're like, okay, it's been rejected twice, once for not being commercial and once for being commercial. So that's what happens, and that's why it's a tricky kind of area to photograph. Okay, and then this isn't a specific rule, but these are kind of my closing comments on the subject. Sometimes things change over time. So I've noticed that the sites have generally become more conservative. So more stuff that was accepted as commercial earlier has now become acceptable only as editorial. So it's like anything in life. The tendency is for rules to be continually generating and expanding, and so that affects Microstock as well. So you'll look on the site and you'll see photographs uploaded commercially that you can't upload now as commercial. You have to upload as editorial, and it's frustrating because you're going off what you've seen on the site. But if you look, sometimes those images are all 2015, so they're older. And the rules might have been different then, and they don't necessarily go back and flush everything back out. So you have to keep that in mind. And the problem with it is that it makes it harder to compete with a pre-existing image that's roughly in the same ballpark, but is accepted as commercial, and yours now is only acceptable as editorial. So that's an issue, and you just have to sort of. There's nothing you can really do about it. It happens. And I haven't talked about releases, but it's kind of been the underlying assumption here that you're not releasing because it's hard to get released images. Maybe of your own house, it's easy, but for most things you can't. So you can always change the game by getting releases for each element of the image. The building owner releases, the logo on the side releases, and the person standing on the sidewalk out front releases. I mean, it's almost impossible for some situations, and some people will never release anyway. So you just have to go editorial there. Yeah, and like I said before, each site is different. They have a slightly different take on it. They have slightly different risk tolerances. Um, some sites will take no Disney at all. You know, like for example, like Shutterstock or Adobe. But Dreamsun has Disney images, so you just have to you have to learn those rules and get a sense and try to go with it. So those are the general rules. That's how I basically do my commercial exterior of building photography. Hopefully this was of interest and helpful, and hopefully I explained it okay. I can get a little rambly and start talking about things or forget things that I meant to say. So hopefully this helps actually, particularly if you're new to the game or if you're getting frustrated over some of the rejections. Yeah, so stay tuned for more content. I'm going to try to do more videos that are about helping you do better on Microstock, and not just the earnings videos, which are easy and fun to do, but just trying to get the community better with Microstock so that we can get some of that money out there. Anyway, take care. We'll see you in the next one.